Thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming. This is a great spot to be just after lunch. I know the feeling, so this is going to be a very technical talk. So if you feel that you need to close your eyes to understand better what I do or what I'm talking about, then you're welcome to do it. Please, no loud snoring. So my name is Geri, and I will talk about Control-Flow Flattening. Yeah, this is who I am. I work for Fortinet and FortiGuard Labs, which is the research and development part of Fortinet. I come from pen testing. I did penetration testing and ethical hacking for around 10 years, most of it for Siemens. And after that, I changed to the defense side at Fortinet, and now I do threat intelligence and malware research. This is going to be about malware research. I'm originally from Hungary. I live in Germany. Yeah, that's pretty much me. About this talk, there will be a quick introduction about obfuscation, etc. Then I will talk about Control-Flow Flattening, what it is and why we should care about it. And then I'm going to introduce 3 different ways to deal with Control-Flow Flattening. That's going to be pattern matching, emulation, and symbolic execution. So, the quick intro. So why do we need to talk about Control-Flow Flattening, or more generally, why do we need to talk about obfuscation? Probably you also figured that in the last years there was an interesting change in the whole cybercrime business. So in the past, threat actors would do the whole attack themselves. They would, compromise an organization. They would deploy their payload. They would collect the money and, I don't know, move to the Bahamas and enjoy life. However, that changed quite a lot. And one of that change is that different groups started to focus on different aspects of an attack. So, for instance, we have initial access brokers, and their main focus is to, compromise organizations and then sell that access to the organization. Then we have malware authors, like malware as a service providers or ransomware as a service providers, and their main focus is to create malware, create ransomware, and then, additional support and things like that. But the main point here is that with this shift, the malware authors can now focus solely on creating better malware. And it's not that they can, they also have an incentive because they're also competing with each other. So, to make better business as a malware as a service provider, you should create better malware. And one of the ways to create better malware is to make it more difficult to analyze. And that's basically where obfuscation comes in. That's just one of the ways how malware authors can make their malware better and more difficult to analyze. To underline that a little bit with data, this is from the time when I started to work on this whole concept. This is from FortiEDR. It's a half a years of telemetry from FortiEDR, and you can see that the most triggered tactic on EDR was defense evasion. So obviously there is a huge focus in building defense evasions into malware. And then to talk about obfuscation, generally, I think you're all familiar with the idea. It's not a silver bullet. It's more of a ball and chain for the reverse engineer. So it's usually very cheap for the threat actor, so for the malware author, because there are obfuscation framework for most of the programming languages out there. So you can just take the obfuscation tool of your choice for your programming language and run it on your malware. And it takes after you have the build environment set up, it takes a couple of seconds to obfuscate your program. But on the other hand, it's very expensive for the analyst. So a malware which you can analyze in a couple of hours, if there is no obfuscation, could take to analyze a week if there are multiple obfuscation techniques are implemented. So in this talk, we are going to focus on C, because that's what I used for the examples I wrote. and we are going to use the Tigress framework, but I will talk about that a little bit later. Now, about Control-Flow Flattening. So, Control-Flow Flattening is an obfuscation technique, and its goal is to obfuscate the control flow of a function in a malware. So what you see on the image, and I'm not sure, yeah, you're not, oh, no, you're seeing my mouse. I will try to navigate. So what you're seeing here on the image is the control flow graph of a function. So the boxes are basic blocks in that function. So some code that's going to be executed, and the reason why we have control flow graphs for functions is because it's very helpful. So anything about the function, just looking at the control flow graph, so the left side image, we can already establish or figure out many things about this function. So there is some kind of decision done at the red basic block. Then some code is executed in the green or in the purple, and then in the peach or I don't know pink basic block, we have some other decision which is basically about whether to leave the loop or not. And if we stay in the loop, then it goes back to the red block, and if we leave the loop, we go to the yellow block, which is some kind of exit state. So without knowing anything about this function, we already see that there is looping, there is some decisions, etc. And the control-flow flattening tries to take away all this quick knowledge or information gathering that we can do based on the control flow graph. So the control flow flattening is turning the image on the left to the image on the right. So it's called flattening because you see how the structure changed into like a flat structure, and most of your basic blocks are going to be in the middle in that flat architecture. And then you will have, that's what I'm going to call original basic blocks. The original basic blocks are the basic blocks that are containing the actual logic of the original function. Then we have dispatcher basic blocks. In this image, that's only the red block now, which is going to maintain the state for this state machine. So it's essentially a state machine, and there is some kind of state involved. And the state machine decides which original basic blocks should be called next, and the code that maintains this state machine is the dispatcher or the dispatcher basic blocks. So if you look at the real function, this is from IDAPro. Then the one on the left top, that's the original control flow of the function. And as you can see, it's a little bit more complex than the example before, but it's still not tragic. So we still see that there are like a couple of loops, there are a couple of decisions, but there's nothing extremely complex. But once we use the simplest control flow flattening that we can find, we already get the image at the bottom, which is already more complex. So you can see that it added some complexity and also took away some fast knowledge gathering. And the code on the right, that's basically the decompiled code of that same function after control flow flattening. So you can see that it's in a while loop, and we have a huge switch case, because usually that's how you can implement a state machine, a finite state machine in a switch case. And then in this case we have a state maintained in a variable that's going to be set at the end of all case elements. And just an example of my emotional state when I was looking at the control flow flattened malware. This was actually the first one I found, or I had to reverse. It looks much worse than it should, because it was .NET, so it's even more complex on the control flow graph, and it would be if it would be in C. But you can see that this is not something that you really want to reverse. So when you have to deal with something like this is not something that you want to reverse manually. Okay, so to demonstrate the techniques I'm gonna show, I wrote a simple ransomware. As every modern day researcher, I obviously use ChatGPT to do my bidding. I use state-of-the-art 1-byte XOR to do encryption, and it basically looks for a specific file extension on the disk, and when it finds them, then it calls the function that you can see in the code. That's the encode and save file function that's going to be responsible to apply the encryption, and then they rename the file with the .noob extension and save it on the disk. So the function is pretty simple, and this is the function that we are gonna obfuscate later on. So this is how it looks like before obfuscation. It's very simple. And we are going to use Tigress. Tigress is an open source tool developed by University of Arizona. So it's available for everybody. And it does a lot of different obfuscation. Control-Flow Flattening is just one of them. And it also implements multiple techniques to implement Control-Flow Flattening. We are gonna use the simplest, which is the switch case finite state machine, as I mentioned before. So basically, if you apply the command line there with Tigress on the original source code of my ransomware, the Tigress works on the source code level. So basically, you give source code to it. It's going to obfuscate it through source code. So it's going to generate an obfuscated source code for you. And that's what you see on the screenshot. And again, you see that there is again an infinite while loop. And then we have a huge switch case statement that's actually implementing our state machine for the Control-Flow Flattened function. So, but our goal is to deal with Control-Flow Flattening somehow. And when I see Control-Flow Flattening, this is pretty much my initial reaction to it. But obviously, I'm paid to do this, so I have to figure out some way to deal with it. And that's kind of my go-to. So obviously, we can go two ways, static and dynamic analysis. In this talk, I'm going to focus on static analysis. So I mentioned that we can do emulation, symbolic execution, and pattern matching. But dynamic analysis is a good way to go as well, especially if you don't have time. So all the techniques I'm going to show, they are the increase in complexity, and that also increases in time investment. But it allows you to do a full reverse engineering, so to understand exactly what the malware is doing. The dynamic analysis can be very useful if you don't have time. If it's an incident response and you need answers really fast, then you can do sandbox detonations to quickly gather IOCs. Or sometimes you're not really interested in what that binary does, because maybe it's just a loader and you just want to get the next payload. Then you can just run it to get the next payload and ignore the rest. And debugging can be also very useful, although it's also very painful, because you basically have to single step through everything without really knowing what's happening. Okay, so let's get into the general idea of how to restore the control flow. So our goal is to, we have this flattened function, and we somehow want to restore the control flow so that we know how the function looked originally. And these are the steps that we need to do. So first step, we need to identify the original basic blocks. I marked them here as green. By looking at it, it's very easy, because they are usually the long basic blocks, because that's where the logic of the program is, so the logic of the function. So those are always the longer basic blocks, because they actually do something interesting. Then we have to identify the decision basic blocks. I haven't mentioned decision basic blocks before. Here you can see the blue boxes that are followed by two white boxes. So what happens if in the original function the basic block ended in a decision, so basically a branching, then once you flatten that function, then that decision is going to be moved into the decision basic blocks. because of how control-flow flattening works. So basically, first, your original basic blocks is going to execute, so a green block. Then it's going to go back to the dispatcher. The dispatcher will take it to decision basic block, and that's where the decision is going to be evaluated and decide where it should go next. And then it goes into the dispatcher again, and that's when it's actually going to continue in the next original basic blocks. So we need the decision basic blocks to find out which next box can come after the previous original basic block. Then we need to identify the state variable, so which is also relatively easy. Usually at the end of each original basic blocks, we are going to set the state variable so that the dispatcher knows which next state should come next. Also, in the decision basic blocks, in the white boxes, we are going to set the state variable again to tell the dispatcher which basic blocks should come next. And then we can map these state variables to the original basic blocks. So we can say that, okay, the state variable 1 is this original basic block, and the state variable number 2 is that original basic block. And once we have this mapping, then we can recover the next state. So what next state should come after state 1? It should be, let's say, state 2 and state 3. And once we have all this information, then we can put all this together to reconstruct the original control flow. Okay, and let's go into the different techniques. So I start with pattern matching. I don't know how is it here in Poland. In Hungary, when you do your driver's license exam, obviously every time you sit in your car, you have to check your tire pressure. And on the exam, how you do it is you look at the tire and then you say this, pre-learned sentence that with visual inspection, I determined that the tire pressure is adequate. So that's how we had to do it. And this is kind of how pattern matching feels, because we are just like strongly looking at the assembly code and then trying to find heuristics in the assembly code. So basically, we need to find ways to identify what is an original basic block, what is a decision basic block, etc. So one example here is that when we want to identify an original basic block, we can say that it must be a basic block with more than 3 instructions, because it has to do something interesting. Then the last instruction is a fixed jump, because if we go back a little bit, you see that all original basic block go to one basic block at the bottom that's going to redirect everything back to the dispatcher. So all original basic blocks will go there. And because of that, we can say that it's an original basic block if it ends in a fixed jump. Then the second to last instruction is a move instruction, because it's going to set the state variable. So with that, we also know that what's the variable name where the state value is stored. So once we identify these heuristics, we just have to implement this in some kind of programming languages. So the tools I wrote, they are all IDAPython scripts, so you can run them in IDA Pro. And this is basically how you identify an original basic block. I just put all these defined heuristics into an if statement, and if all are true, then we can say that the basic blocks we are looking at is an original basic block. So it's pretty easy. So pattern matching is relatively easy, but you can't really reuse the code you're writing for one malware to another, or even for one function to another in the same malware. But otherwise, it's relatively easy. All right, I will try with the demo. Yeah, that doesn't work that way. Oh. Okay, I don't do the demo because it's impossible with the screens. So yeah, let's continue with that. Maybe if we have time at the end, I will twist my head to do that. So once you do pattern matching, so we basically have this IDAPython script that we run in IDA, and it's going to spit out that that data on the right side, which is basically a description of a graph. And when we visualize that description, then we got the graph on the left side. And if I compare this to the original control flow graph of this program, then it's the same. So yay, we won. So pattern matching works pretty well. You just have to identify these heuristics. For all these steps we discussed, I just showed you one example, but you need to do all the steps I described previously, and then you can implement that in Python. Now the second is emulation. For emulation, I use FlareEmu. It's a pretty great tool for doing emulation. In my experience, emulation works well as kind of hunting for low-hanging fruits. So I try to use emulation also to fully recover the control flow graph, but it was very painful and it really didn't work. So ultimately, where I see it has been more useful is to implement it quickly and see what you get. And if what you get is useful, then you won. If what you got is not useful, then just move on to something else. So to identify the original basic blocks, I use the same pattern matching as before. And then I use emulation for the rest of the steps. This is emulation, so for instance, you have to do additional stuff like defining the arguments for this function. The files don't have to exist because it's just emulated, so it's not going to touch the disk or anything. But you have to give some arguments to this function call. And what you see in the code is how we set up FlareEmu, and when I say emulate range, that's when I start the emulation, and I say that emulate this function, and I set an instruction hook, and that's basically a callback function that is going to be called every time an instruction is called in the emulated code. Registers just holds the function argument, and in the hook data, we just keep data that we want to keep for the whole emulation. So that's going to be available for us every time we exit the emulation to do something. And this is the instruction hook, and it seems to be a lot, but it's only because of the comments and because of some error handling. Otherwise, it's basically just tracing what's happened. So the only thing I do here is that whenever an instruction is called, I look at whether this basic block has already been recorded as being executed. If not, I record it in my database, and then I move on. And with that, basically, I'm just implementing a simple trace. I'm just recording how each basic block is executed after each other as the binary is emulated. So again, I leave the demo for the end, and we get the emulation results. Now, in the emulation, I added some statistics that you see on the right side, some coverage statistics. So ultimately, we covered 51% of all basic blocks in the function. So we emulated 51% or executed 51% of the basic blocks in the function. And that's 44% of all original basic blocks. So this was pretty disappointing. So I wasn't really happy about this. I thought this totally failed, and emulation is useless. And then you see that's the graph that we get. So it's very straightforward, literally. But once I started to look into what these basic blocks are actually doing, which you see at the bottom, so the first one is starting the function and logging to console. Then the second basic block is opening the file. Then the third is reading the content of the file. And the last one is encrypting the content of the file. So once we go through this, we see that, oh, this is actually what this function does. Like all the other basic blocks in the function are just like error handling and administration basic blocks. So the main functionality of this function is in these 4 basic blocks. So and that's what I meant as hunting for low-hanging fruits, because we do the emulation and this doesn't take too long. So we can implement this in a half an hour or so if you're familiar with the tools. and then basically it gives you the main part of the function that you should reverse manually. So obviously we are just now trying to, it's not full automation, we are just trying to help ourselves figuring out which part of the code should we reverse manually. And this is exactly what we get from emulation. So emulation is really good. You can set it up fast, and it might give you, useful information. If it doesn't, as I said, just move on to the next thing. And the next thing might be symbolic execution. And this is kind of how I feel when I do symbolic execution. Although I'm dealing with symbolic execution for a long time, but it still really feels like black magic. If you're not familiar with the concept, it basically says that instead of running our program with fixed values, we run them with symbolic values. And this way, we are executing every path in the program at the same time. So basically, we say that let's take every value and make them symbolic. And whenever an if comes, so whenever a decision is made, we actually are going to keep executing both branches, so both ends of the decision, but we are recording what was the decision, and this way we are creating basically mathematical formulas of what decisions are made to get to a specific part of the program. So symbolic execution is often used in capture the flags because you can solve things like serial number generators and things like that, because if there is a point in the program where it checks a serial number and it says that, yeah, this is a valid serial number, then you do symbolic execution and you tell the execution framework that, tell me what is the condition to get to that point in the program where we have a valid serial number, and then you get like a huge mathematical formula, and once you solve that, it tells you a valid serial number that is going to take you to that point. So this is kind of what we are also going to try to exploit in our case to point in different parts of the program and ask the symbolic execution framework how we can get to this point. I'm going to use the Anger framework. That's a very well known symbolic execution framework written mostly, I think, in C and Python. And but you can already expect that symbolic execution is very time-consuming if you're not very familiar with it. Even if you're very familiar with it, it can be still very time-consuming. The good thing is that we can skip many steps because symbolic execution will take care of us. So the first example, what I wanted to show you is how to map state values to original basic blocks. So basically, we are going to tell the symbolic execution framework to execute until the beginning of each original basic blocks. And once we get to that point, we are just going to look into the memory and see what is the state value in memory, which is going to be, again, a mathematical equation. But once we solve that, we get a real value. And this is what's happening here. We say there's the for, so we tell that to do this for every original basic block we know. We take the entry point of the original basic block and then tell the simulation manager to explore to that address, so it basically executes until it arrives at that address. And once we are there, we look at, we know where the state value should be in memory, because we saw it in the assembly code. So we just look into the memory and ask the SMT solver to concretize that value, so basically solve that equation for us, and that's going to be a valid state value. And we do this for all original basic blocks, and then we have a state value for each original basic block. Okay, the next thing we do is to recover the next state. So basically, we now arrive to one original basic blocks, but we want to figure out what next states could come after this basic block. And this could be either one original basic block or two if there is a decision basic block in between. So basically what we are going to do is we are going to single step through. Single stepping in symbolic execution is executing each one basic block at a time. So one step is one basic block. So we are just going to single step, and every time we check whether we reached the new original basic block, and if we did, we look at how we got there. So here we are just setting up our execution. So the beginning is the same. So we went to each original basic block, and for each original basic block we try to find every next state. And this is what we see here. So the while loop is doing the single stepping. I just put a counter there so that if we single step more than 20 times, then something probably went wrong, so we can just exit, and then after that debug. But we keep single stepping, and after each step, we check how many active states we have, and if we have just one active state, then we know that we reached our next original basic block. If we have two active states, then we might need to keep executing until we find the other next original basic block, and then we basically just record these. So in this way, we will have connection between one original basic block and its potential next states. Okay, and then this way, you again see the results on the right side, and then once we visualize that, we get the results on the left side, which is very similar to what we got in pattern matching. There is just one difference. There is one basic block missing. I looked it up, and it was the exit basic block, so where it exits the function or the program, and because of how I defined original basic block, it was ignored. But ultimately, it's the same thing. So it could recover the whole control flow graph the same way as pattern matching did, but with using symbolic execution. One note to why I'm doing these graphs. I actually tried to restore the control flow in IDAPro. And I've seen people trying to manipulate the binary to restore the control flow, but I found it so time-consuming, and I never really got to a version that was really useful and looking well. So ultimately, my conclusion was that it's better to just create a graph like this and basically have it next to you while you are doing your reversing. And then, whenever you look at some basic block, you can just look at this graph and see where you are in the execution, instead of trying to force yourself to restore it in IDAPro. Yeah. And finally, an honorary mention is debugging. So when all things fail, you can do debugging, and it's going to work decently. So even though as you are doing the single stepping, most of the time you don't really know exactly where you are at the binary, but you will see, what kind of API functions are called, what are the different arguments for function calls, etc. So it's going to allow you to understand most of the functionality of the program, although it's not going to give you a full understanding of how this function works. But if you are under time pressure, it's definitely a doable thing to do. So if everything fails, just go for debugging. Okay, so conclusion: CFF is hell. Especially if it's combined with other obfuscation techniques. So it can get much worse when you have 2-3 other obfuscation techniques on the top of Control-Flow Flattening. It can take you from, instead of working a couple of hours, working 2 weeks on the same malware. And if your use case doesn't allow you to do 2 weeks on that malware, then that's bad. But what you should do, I think first you should try dynamic analysis. So run in commercial sandboxes, run it on your own sandbox, your own VMs, and see what information you can recover. It might be enough for whatever your goal was. then if you want to continue, then try emulation, because it's relatively easy to set up, and it might give you very useful insight into the malware, although it's not going to be a full, state or control flow recovery. And check if you want to continue, then you can do pattern matching. That's relatively easy, but it involves some coding. And only go into symbolic execution if time really allows it, or you are very, very familiar with symbolic execution and anger. It's not something that that you can easily learn during a live, reversing. It's probably you need to invest time more in advance to learn about how the tool works, what strategies you can use to do symbolic execution. And once you get all that set up, then once you have a malware to reverse where you need symbolic execution, then you can do that. But otherwise, the learning curve is pretty bad. All right, so that was it. We do have some time, so. Oh yeah, thank you. Are there any questions? All right, I can try with the demo. Yeah.
Hi, just wondering how often do you encounter this obfuscation?
Actually, more and more. So I've seen it quite a lot. As the example I showed was in .NET, so it comes up in .NET also very often. I've seen it in different C++ ransomware. So I think it comes up a lot nowadays. And honestly, like if you're a malware author and you're not using Control-Flow Flattening, then you're dumb, because it's such an easy thing to implement, and it's really bad for the analyst. So I don't want to promote it for malware authors, but that's the thing. So I'm going to be not surprised if that's going to be the majority of malware in the future. Obviously, like the malware samples that are either for newer threat actors or not so sophisticated actors, they're probably not going to use it. But those who are really run it as a business and have the incentive to invest time in figuring this out, they are going to use it, I think. Sure. There is another question there.
Hey, great presentation. I just wanted to ask, I was wondering if some of the methods you use, especially for like pattern matching, have you been able to make like Yarrow rules or anything like that to identify like binaries that might use certain techniques for control flow flattening?
You mean to identify whether a malware is control flow flattened or not? Sorry. Okay, yeah. So no, that wasn't my goal, because the pattern matching I tried to use was with the goal of trying to restore the control flow. So like, it's basically when you already have a sample in front of you and you just want to solve that sample and not to find samples. But there is research on the internet which does that. So I don't remember whether there was any kind of Yarrow rules involved, because it was more of like a mathematical statistical level analysis of figuring out whether there is control flow flattening in the binary. So there is research on that, but that wasn't my personal goal. No. Anything else? Okay, no. All right, I will try to do what's that? Yeah. So the demo. So this is the pattern matching. Maybe I overhyped now the demo. There is not going to be a lot of magic happening. I will execute this script, and then there will be some output there. So as you can see, This was basically pattern matching. So it just goes through, it identifies the different basic blocks, and then it spits out the graph that we have seen before. This is, by the way, the same function we were looking at, so you might remember this thing, the encrypt and save file thing. Emulation. Let's run it. Now you already feel that there is a little bit more computing done in the background, so emulation already runs a little bit more, but it's because it's already, it has to set up the framework, etc. Also, the general problem with emulation is that it's emulating, so it's not really running, and it really depends on how much external functions are called, because those are going to be also just emulated. So if it really depends on a lot of external things, then the emulation is not going to be very useful. Now we do symbolic execution. So Anger likes to talk a lot, so there's a lot of things happening. And one problem with symbolic execution is state explosion. So basically that you have so many state that you can't deal with it anymore. And that's why when you do symbolic execution, you have to focus on just a little part of the code that you're trying to understand, and only run that in a symbolic way and concretize everything else as possible, because otherwise it's going to run forever basically. Yeah, and we got the same result. So that was symbolic execution. So you already saw the rest. So that's pretty much it for the demo. All right, thanks a lot, and have a good one.